Welcome to Bill's Aviation Podcast, where your stories are our stories. I'm a general aviation pilot, aviation writer, airplane builder, avionics developer, test pilot, and general screw-up. All stories feature Joe and his merry band of miscreants. The purpose of these stories is to educate and entertain pilots. If you have a story you'd like to share anonymously, please contact me. Today's story is titled VFR and IFR Icing Conditions. Joe was taking a cross-country flight that took him halfway across the country. The flight was so long that he was going to have to stop for fuel. He took off mid-afternoon with broken clouds at about 4,000 feet MSL. Not wanting to get above the clouds, he slowed down and stayed at 2,500 feet, putting up with the bumps. The visibility was unlimited below the clouds, even if it was bumpy. As was usual for this trip, Joe was using flight following, more out of boredom than anything else. As Joe cut the corner under a Class Bravo, the controller issued him a frequency change. Upon checking in with the new frequency, Joe hit some pretty violent bumps, and as tends to happen, the pitch of his voice rose and fell with the up and down drafts. The controller cleared Joe into the Bravo and said that if he can get above the clouds will close in below him, but will be clear at his fuel stop. Joe thanked the controller and worked his way around the clouds and up to 8,500 feet and into smooth, clear air. As the controller said, the clouds did close in under him. Joe wasn't worried, as he still had a long way to go, 3/4 tanks of fuel, and the white below him as far as he could see. 200 miles later, he was given a new center frequency, which he monitored. At this point, Joe had been flying over the clouds for longer than he had expected, but Joe still believed the advice the prior controller had given him, and he had reached the point of no return. As Joe settled in with the new center controller, he still had plenty of fuel and 100 miles left to go to his fuel stop. At this point, the promised broken cloud layer never appeared. Joe saw solid white below him in all directions. Not a good position to be stuck in, he thought to himself. The other pilots on the frequency started complaining about icing conditions in the clouds. Joe sat up straight at the sound of multiple pilots reporting quick and heavy ice accumulations in the clouds and demanding they get different altitudes to get out of the clouds. From all the banter between the other pilots and the center controller, Joe determined the cloud tops were about 4,000 feet and the bottoms were down at 2,000 feet. Not too bad, only 2,000 feet of isolated clouds to go through, he thought to himself. Gulp. Neither Joe nor his airplane were equipped for IFR icing conditions. Joe felt confident that the autopilot in his aircraft could hold a heading while descending through the clouds without a problem. However, the ice accumulation the other pilots were reporting were of great concern to him. 20 miles from his destination, Joe told the center controller he was letting down. The controller approved the descent and reminded Joe to remain clear of clouds. Yeah, right, Joe thought to himself. Knowing the controller approved the descent and that there was no traffic on his ADS-B receiver, he felt comfortable that he wasn't going to hit another aircraft. His only concern was keeping the plane upright and getting through the icing he had heard about. With the autopilot set for a 500 foot per minute descent, Joe started downhill. Immediately upon entering the clouds, ice started to form on his wings, windscreen, everywhere, and it was forming fast. Joe increased the autopilot descent rate to 700 feet per minute, and the ice continued to pile up. At least the higher airspeed due to the descent rate. I probably won't stall, Joe thought to himself. When Joe popped out of the bottom of the cloud layer and could breathe again, looking around, he realized he had a little more than 1/4 of an inch of ice completely covering his aircraft, with the big ice protrusions on the leading edge. The good news was that the ice sublimated almost as quickly as it had accumulated, and by the time Joe entered the traffic pattern for his fuel stop, it was almost completely gone. Lesson learned. When offered advice from air traffic control, it is still up to you as the PIC to determine if taking their advice is safe and proper. Also, don't be afraid to let the controllers know of your situation. They are there to help should you find yourself in a pickle. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed what you heard, please hit the like button and subscribe by clicking on the logo in the lower right of your screen. If you really like what you heard, please help support this channel and become a Patreon. Part of each donation will go to aviation safety and aviation youth programs. Be sure to check out next week's story about Joe running out of fuel on short final.